Hello, good evening. Welcome to the incredibly cold Tortoise newsroom, which has been scientifically proven today to be the coldest room in Europe. So that's why there's only a handful of us here. And it does make me think, how nice will it be, hopefully in September, when at 6:15 we'll get all our lovely members streaming in and having glasses of poor quality wine and chatting outside and then coming in, and it'll be really uncomfortably hot then when it's full of people. But it isn't this evening. I'm Liz Mosley and I'm back after a bit of time away, and it's lovely to be here. This evening is the Open News meeting, and we have Nimo and Lara and Paul here in the room, and hopefully lots of lovely Tortoises and members watching along. On my list, I would like to talk about Tunisia, I'd like to talk about the Olympics, and I'd like to talk about executive pay. But if you have something on your mind that you'd like us to talk about this evening, either for editorial ideas over the sort of next 4 weeks or so, or looking further ahead and into the autumn. We are obviously in sort of active autumn planning mode at the moment before we take a little bit of a break for ThinkIns after Thursday. Please do pile in. Ellen Halliday is in the chat. And here's a thing that somebody's told me about 3 minutes ago. In fact, it was my colleague Phoebe, she's over there, which is if you press Command and plus on your keyboard, it makes the typeface size of the chat much bigger. And that is an absolute game changer for me, because I no longer have to wear my glasses in order to do a thinking. And because I'm vain, I'm very thrilled with that tip. Well done, Phoebe. Thank you very much. So we're going to start with, I think we'll start with Tunisia before I come to Kim and Patricia on executive pay. And that is with you, Lara and Paul, Team Sensemaker on the sofa. So this story kind of broke, was it overnight here? I sort of woke up to it this morning of how it's evolved. But maybe, Lara, would you just give us a sort of backstory of how we've ended up where we are now?
Sure. So, I mean, in the most recent event, Sunday night, the president... Sunday night, the president essentially began a coup whereby he wanted to take control from Parliament, and then that has played out over the last kind of 48 hours. And there have been a string of protests from both sides, and it's yet to kind of be clear what's going to be happening for him. But obviously, this stretches back months and even years since the Arab Spring. This is kind of the last fledgling democracy since then, and there's been a lot of pressure, not just with the pandemic, but before then with high levels of youth unemployment and a struggling economy, and multiple elections, which have meant that it was pretty unstable going into this crisis. And since the pandemic hit, has been very, very unstable. So that was a real reason why this has been such a catalysed problem. You had kind of 3 health ministers since the pandemic began. You have had soaring Delta infections, whereas in 2020 it looked like the country might be able to contain COVID. It's now been seeing some of the highest death rates in the world. And so we're now in a situation where largely unvaccinated population is seeing huge levels of rising cases, and the public, understandably extremely kind of unhappy with this, have many of them supporting the president in this coup because they feel like the political elite have really let them down. So we're not really sure, obviously, whether or not this is going to be successful. Many people who sympathise with the public over this, still with kind of the president over this, still think that the rule of law is much more important, and that actually fair and free elections are worth fighting for, even though the country's in a desperate state. So it seems to be a kind of deeply polarised situation, and it's not sure how it's going to play out.
Thanks, Laura. My question, I've got a number of questions about this, but in terms of us here at Tortoise, how is what's actually gone down in Tunisia over the last couple of days, how is it related to vaccines? Because there's an entanglement there that I'm just trying to get my head around how it relates to the arms race and what we're trying to do with that.
Sure. So I think a lot of people, when they've looked at the fact that low-income countries are still largely unvaccinated, and here in the UK we're looking at kind of 9 in 10 adults who have had their first dose, so a hugely stark divide between the wealthy and the less wealthy countries insofar as their vaccines go. Before, we've seen a lot of talk around variants, and that's very clear here, because the Delta variant is one of the reasons why this situation is so acutely disastrous for Tunisia, and is one of the reasons why their healthcare system has been unable to cope. But it's also kind of the first example that we're seeing of where large vaccine inequality and continuing COVID leads to political instability.
Right.
And so this is I think, a situation that could unfurl in a lot of Africa where specifically the Delta is now raging, and where kind of people are incredibly unhappy with the situation, quite rightly so, and political instability and violence is actually a real possibility for them.
So what happens now in Tunisia?
So it's still unclear whether or not this coup is going to be successful. As I said, it's
if it's successful, as in if it's going to hold.
As in, yeah, so as in if the president and much of the military who he's been able to muster in supporting him is going to be able to kind of continue to overrun the parliament in this standoff. And because we're still fairly unclear on where public opinion actually is on this, we know it's very polarized, but it's not necessarily clear which arms of government and which arms of power are going to be successful in this.
Paul, what do you think?
I think, so we've been interested in Tunisia because its COVID death rate is the second highest in the world, so second to Namibia. And it's one of these classic problem countries that Lara described, where the starting level of vaccine uptake was very low, so 8% in Tunisia. And so when the Delta variant spread to the country, the population was completely defenseless. The background to that low vaccine uptake is unlike what's happening in advanced economies. The problem is that Tunisia was expecting a lot of deliveries from multilateral organizations and through bilateral agreements, but for various reasons they never arrived.
Right.
So Tunisia found itself without enough doses, to provide even a minimal level of protection to its population.
So to understand, sorry to interrupt. So the Tunisian parliament, the government that has now been ousted, they had ostensibly done their job. They'd kind of managed to get themselves on the list of vaccines that were supposed to be arriving, but for one reason or another, that didn't happen.
I mean, it's a mixture of things. So that, the healthcare sector in a lot of these countries isn't equipped to deal with any kind of pandemic. But if there's one kind of thing that can really help in this case, it's very plentiful deliveries of vaccines, which never arrived. It's the same situation in Namibia, which, for example, opened up vaccine centers, began receiving people only to turn them away because deliveries were delayed. And a lot of those people are never, they're never going to go back to a vaccine center. They're just going to stay home, not pay for another journey out. I think in Tunisia, the really tragic thing is, as Lara said, it's North Africa's only democracy, so it's the only Arab Spring country to have kind of cleared that hurdle. And the problem now is people look at its democratic or ostensibly democratic government as a failure because it mismanaged the pandemic response so badly. And may, in the long run, delegitimize democracy as the idea of it in Tunisia.
Yeah. And what's the kind of timeline for this? There's a sort of obviously an acute issue that's happening now in the country. Is it over the next week it will become apparent what path the country is going to take, or will it take longer? I don't have any sense of, because people are dying now, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are dying now, right?
They are. So again, its death rate is the second highest in the world. Right? So really high. And it's rising. And, the really, in the medium to long run, the pandemic can be brought under control. The political fallout, who knows? What the president did, as Lara said, was really, really unusual, and it's what made the news for Tunisia. Whether he can kind of stay in power with the army's support is really anyone's guess, I think, at this point.
And is there a concerted effort from the international community to support or help, or does everybody just run the other way when there's a coup of this nature?
The Biden administration overnight did pledge their support to democracy in Tunisia, but obviously,
what does that
pledging
in
rhetorical
practice
support
mean?
is very difficult, very different from, especially when everybody's got their own domestic concerns, and we've seen that throughout the pandemic. Very different from lending any practical support to people who are pro-democracy in Tunisia right now. So it's uncertain whether or not there is going to be a concerted practical effort from the international community to protect democracy in Tunisia.
So I guess we'll keep an eye on it from a sense maker perspective and see how that, and perhaps Namibia and the neighbouring countries, how that situation evolves. Laura, just while we're with you, do you want to just talk to us a bit about the arms race and what has developed, if anything? Give us some good news, Laura, come on.
Sure. There's not a huge amount of good news, sadly, as far as global vaccination and the campaign to vaccinate the world from the international community side goes. There was an announcement on Monday from the World Bank and COVAX that they would be freeing up much more capital to help donate and deliver more vaccines to places that need it most. But as Paul has made very clear, the past month has seen not a huge commitment in extra donations. Obviously, the much reported failure at Carbis Bay to deliver any more than 1 billion has been well noted. But even since then, we've not seen a huge kind of surge in donations, but we have seen a huge surge in the Delta variant in some of these most vulnerable places. So there's unfortunately not a huge amount of good news on that front. Obviously, people are looking ahead to the G20 in Rome in October in the hope that leaders will massively step up then. There was a small amount of good news last week where the EU announced that Team Europe, which is their phrase for their kind of effort towards vaccination, would actually be exceeding their targets by, I think, about 50% in the number of donations and in the amount of money that they'd be giving to something called the ACT Accelerator, which is a kind of aside to COVAX, which helps with not just vaccines, but other parts of pandemic response, which obviously in places like Tunisia and elsewhere is equally as essential as vaccines. So that's a small amount of good news, but there's still kind of overriding evidence that the kind of wealthiest countries in the world don't fully grasp how the scale of action that is needed on this. So it's not particularly positive, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Laura. I'm just going to bring in Louise Simpson, who's made an interesting comment in the chat that reminds me of a thinking we did right at the very beginning of the year where we were talking about communication and messaging. Hi, Louise.
Hi.
Hiya. I just wonder, you just tell us what you were saying about, is this En Marche? Is that a shop, a French shop?
No, it's the political party that I don't quite know what the relationship is, but they back Macron.
Right. And they're offering 3 reasons for getting vaccinated. Is this in like a sort of government-wide, like a national advertising campaign, the kind of hands, face, space type thing in France?
I suspect it will be, and I mean they've just sent it to people who are members of En Marche. So, but they're definitely pushing. You know, there are vaccination centres everywhere. You know, even in the chateau at the moment. So they're really pushing it. But you know, just get over kind of the loss of your freedom. If you could just see actually that it's giving you freedom, it's just such a simple phrase.
Do you know what the other ones are? The first and the third. If the second one is for liberty, what is the first and the third?
I'd have to go back and see.
Oh, don't worry.
That's the way of sending you the whole stuff into this, but I can't do it. Do you know what I mean? But I can send it to you separately by an email or something. But yes, I mean, I can look back on it, but it'll take me 20 minutes to find it.
But I just wondered if off the top of your head you could remember it. The reason why I'm interested in what Louise is saying is because I wonder if anyone's done the work of trying to match up, just in terms of communications and influencing, how different countries probably would be the frame, have tried to go about persuading people to get vaccinated. Although I know in the arms race, the problem isn't necessarily persuading people to get it, it's actually physically enabling them to do so. I just wonder if that's a sort of interesting thing to look at, what the kind of psychological barriers are rather than the actual practical ones.
So, it is a really interesting question, and we're working on one sense maker for this week about the different reasons for different levels of uptake across countries.
Yeah.
And they are different, like you say. So in a lot of Western European countries and the US, for example, the little or the smaller pockets of unvaccinated places are ones where people are hesitant, because they're worried about side effects or whatever, or they have concerns about their personal liberty. They feel like they're being coerced or forced into taking it. Whereas, of course, in places like Namibia, Tunisia, it's completely different.
Yeah.
And people are desperate for doses. So the messaging will be different.
Yeah.
But again, it speaks to this enormous global inequality in the distribution of these doses.
It would tell a very powerful story. Just the communications themselves would tell it would be a way to sort of understand the way the world is or isn't well disposed to tackle it.
Yeah, and I mean, I've seen some of the French ones, and they're really good. They kind of make it seem very exciting and important to get vaccinated. You'll be able to go out, you'll be able to kiss people. But it shows how different the situation is in France as opposed to North Africa, parts of Asia, where it's really life or death.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see I totally agree. Phoebe's making the point in the chat that in 20 years, or maybe in 5 years, or maybe next year even, if somebody were to gather them all together, all of the communications with a timeline and a distribution, we kind of memorialise these communications like we did Dig for Victory and, those famous Uncle Sam posters. Laurie, you look like you're going to say something.
Well, just, memorialising, I don't know if you've seen the latest government advert to try and get young people to register.
Yes,
to vote.
Let's do shots or something.
It's just lots of people in a club, and and they're all dancing and they're having a lovely time, and it's saying you need to get vaccinated, but of course you can already go to clubs. And I think the communication on whether or not young people are going to need vaccine passports ahead of September has been a bit patchy at best. So it's not necessarily going to be a hugely effective one, I don't think. But it's an interesting question alongside, does these communications mirror the politics? Because obviously that is a really interesting political issue right now, and the way in which the government is framing the vaccination debate on young people, i.e. that we're more vaccine hesitant and they're deeply disappointed at the uptake of young people with vaccines, when actually I think a lot of us would argue that most young people have come forward and had their vaccines, and that is kind of the source of a bit of intergenerational tension at the moment.
Yeah, interesting. Cool. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for helping us to kind of get our heads around Tunisia. It feels like it's one for the SenseMaker team for now. I'm going to come to another branch of your crew. If I can come to Patricia and Kim. Now, you're not here. Maybe we'll start with Patricia. I know it's easier for Phoebe and Connor to find one rather than two. Hey, Patricia.
Hey.
How you doing?
Good, thank you.
Now, you've done the reporting and data work on the SenseMaker special that we did today, which picks up on a theme that we've done a lot of reporting on actually at Tortoise over time on pay, salary levels effectively. We've looked obviously at gender pay gap, we've looked at ethnicity pay gap, we've talked more recently about disability pay, inclusion or otherwise, normally otherwise. And this is specifically about executive pay, thorny issue, ongoing problem, but you've done some analysis on recent, it's FTSE 100 CEOs, right?
Yeah, so all of the work that you've just mentioned falls under the umbrella of the Responsibility 100 Index, which we publish in partnership with Teneo, which looks at the FTSE 100, so the 100 biggest listed companies in the UK. And yeah, we measure a bunch of 120 indicators across all of these companies. But this report that Kim and I worked on, it was Kim's idea to look into companies that have published their finances for the period covering at least 3 months into COVID. So basically anyone who's covered data from June 2020 to now, and looking at those CEOs and how their pay has changed. And what we found is that 38 of the 97 companies that had published that data had seen an increase in CEO pay. We also looked at CEO pay ratio, so how much CEOs were earning compared to the average employee in their company. And yeah, I guess the key finding is that yes, about a third did see an increase. It's maybe not as much as we were expecting, given how much certain companies have been benefiting from the pandemic, but there are some really interesting stats in there, which I can also run through. For example, the CEO of Ocado was earning 59 million in 2019. He's now earning just 6 million, and still that's 312 times more than the average employee.
So sorry, are we talking about salary or are we talking about whole? You can't have a 59 million pound salary, can you?
That's a good question. We're talking about what is known as the single total figure of remuneration in boring annual report terms. In other words, it's the base salary plus bonuses, plus benefits, plus pension, plus
shares?
Something else that I'm forgetting. Yeah, plus the revenue from shares.
Okay.
So it's the kind of total, but it's not sort of the projected what they might earn. It is what they've actually earned. So it's the figures show what they earned over the past financial year, however they choose to report it.
So the chap from Ocado who had earned 59 million quid the previous period, is it like a 12-month period or something?
Yeah.
And now he has earned more like 6. Do we take that to be, that's because he's done the gracious thing and thought the world is having a difficult time, I'll give up the rest of my salary? Or is it because he's kind of a sort of flexible portion of his package has naturally come down? It hasn't delivered in the same way. Like the shares, for example, are worth less. I don't know, I'm making it up, but
I'm not sure exactly what it is in his case. Kim might know, but what we basically, this is why we became interested in the story, because in some cases, sort of a lot of the CEOs cared about the optics of it. And so there were a lot of people who put out public statements, and you see it in the annual report where they said, we cut pay, but they took a pay cut for 3 months quite often between March and June 2020. That's not 3 months, is it? But a certain amount of time. And then actually, when you look at the sort of the longer term across the 12-month period, what we see is a bit of an increase. So some chose to do that, some chose to forego a bonus, which is why we have seen a reduction in quite a lot of the sort of year-on-year data for this. But yeah, in terms of base salary, most of them stayed the same.
And Patricia, with this data that forms part of the overall responsible business index, how does this particular data point, it's only a small data point, relate to the broader company performance in that ranking? Is it big enough to cause a company to move up and down the rankings, or because it's only one data point in a bigger bucket of stuff, it wouldn't be material? I
don't know. We look at, I don't know if we do look at CEO pay as an indicator within the actual index. It's just part of the reporting around it. Within the index itself, one data point wouldn't necessarily cause a massive shift in the company. Yeah. We do look at the sort of company's overall revenue, and that affects various things because of, we calculate stuff as a proportion of that. Yeah, actually, Kim.
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you, Kim. Hiya.
Hello. So we do have an indicator, which is the ratio between the CEO pay and the median pay in the UK.
Right.
And we track that. We've always, we've been tracking that since the start of Responsibility 100. But this was just sort of, we did an update on the data to make sure it was as up to date as possible when we released this piece. But yeah, so we look at that. And we mark companies down for having a very big gap between their CEO pay and the average person in the UK, which is like, it's a judgment call to say that that's a bad thing, obviously, but it's in an aim to sort of track how unequal pay is within these companies.
Kim, I might come to Tessa in a sec on this one. There's a part of me that's a bit, this is a non-story, kind of CEOs of large companies take large pay increases, shocker a bit. But I take the point that 38 out of 97, I think you said, companies had, is the story that the rest of them hadn't. Is that the first time in living memory that a minority did? Do you know what I mean?
So I don't know exactly whether that's the first time in living history that that's happened. But I do think the surprise is not necessarily that, like quite a lot of them have had pay rises. I think that, like, kind of in this context at the moment, I feel like we're very used to seeing the billionaires get richer, the CEO pay go up. We're very used to seeing that sort of rising inequality line. And actually, it is quite interesting, I think, that the majority of CEOs in the FTSE 100 got a pay cut. And actually, it does contrast to the US, where, by the looks of things, the S&P 500, the CEOs are still getting pay rises on average there. So there is a difference. There is something happening. There is some pressure here at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would love to sort of almost dig in deeper to see how much of it is, to your point, how much of it is about optics and how much of it is real, actual reductions in pay, or driven by a desire to sort of right size your remuneration according to the performance of your business, and how much of it actually is just CEOs, businesses who've really struggled in what has been a very challenging time for company performance have ended up taking home less money because their companies haven't done that as well. I'd sort of like to know the detail of it. I'm highly cynical of if your salary is £6 million and you give up 20% of it, it's not really going to hurt that much. Whereas if your salary is £20,000 and you give up 20% of it, or indeed lose your job, it kind of is. Lots of people making comments in the chat about Jeff Bezos selling his shares in Amazon to go to space and what have you. A couple of people making points. Should we go to Ed Davison, if you're there? You've got a question about this, about what we should be looking at. Are you there, Ed? Maybe not. Hello, Ed? No, doesn't look like we can find Ed. Do you know what? I feel like we've talked a lot about CEO pay. Patricia, do you still want to make the point about AstraZeneca? Because that was a thought that occurred to me as well.
Yeah, the AstraZeneca kind of stood out. The CEO earned, I think it was 15 million this year. They've obviously had a very public, they've obviously had a huge year and have spoken very publicly about not wanting the vaccine to be for profit. Yeah. There have also been reports that there's a sort of clause in that they'll make it they'll make it for profit when the pandemic ends, but there's no sort of clarity on when the pandemic will end. So I think it might be worth digging into that. It's sort of half-baked thought, but that's my point.
That's good. That's what Open News is for. Open News is for half-baked thoughts. Absolutely. Right, I'm going to change gear. It's 7:00 and I want to get into the Olympics. If Emily is here, Emily Benn, who is Tortoise's unofficial, in fact, increasingly official Olympics correspondent. Hi, Emily. You weren't feeling very well this morning. Are you all right now?
I am. I think it must be Olympic fever or some sort of.
Just tell me tell me 24 hours in the life of Emily Benn at the moment. When do you sleep?
Well, I'm hoping I'll get more sleep because unfortunately the triathlons have been on the last 2 nights and they start at kind of 11 UK time. And both times I've said I won't watch them because they'll take another 2 hours. But then, Team GB are doing very well in both of them. So then I inevitably, unfortunately, have to stay up because I want to see what happens. And in both, we won silvers. So it was worth it. But it was annoying.
Am I imagining it? Or is there a lot less Olympics coverage this time than there was last time?
Yeah, no, it's quite controversial. The IOC sold the rights pan-European wise to Discovery for 920 million a few years ago. So the BBC, protected by the legal requirement to show a certain amount of Olympics free to air, has only been able to show 2 sports, 2 channels at any one time. In the last few Olympics, we were used to having up to 24 simultaneous streams. So it is a bit, it's like back in the day when you only had BBC One, BBC Two, when we were watching in Atlanta or I guess Sydney, that you wouldn't have had the facility to do it. I don't quite remember, but yeah. So they're limited to 2 streams. So it can be, you get to see, their editorial judgment is how much we get to see in chunks very, very quickly. But I feel for them because we've already won I mean, if you're just from a Team GB perspective and forgetting all the other amazing stories, we've already run, 13 medals. So it's quite a lot to fit in when they're all competing against each other.
I don't know if this is me imagining this with London 2012 tinted glasses, but I seem to remember really good explainers. You're watching a weird sport, you don't quite know what they're doing or how the scoring works. And I feel like at London 2012, I would get the whole really granular, okay, so now they score in this way, and then if this person does this and they get a penalty and that means this. I feel like I'm sort of flying blind a lot. I was trying to understand the Taekwondo. I couldn't make head or tail of it.
I mean, well, that sport is maddening because it all seems, whatever you think is about to happen, it all changes in literally the last 2 seconds.
And then somebody gets knocked out and they get to come back and have another go and maybe win the bronze medal.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're up against a really tough seed at the beginning of the Taekwondo rounds, in order to make it a bit better for you, in the sense that if you lose your first match, then you're out, your entire, life has been messed up in 4.5 minutes, they allow you to enter this repechage thing where you then get to fight for bronze if the person that you lost against also gets very far. So like when Jade Jones lost her first round match a day and a half ago, 2 days ago, I forget exactly, it was actually a refugee team, formerly Iranian, that she lost against. Had they got through to the final, for example, Jade Jones would have been able to fight for bronze, but they didn't. So
yeah,
it's a bit complicated. I think if you now don't have the luxury of 24 live streams with commentators able to do all the bits, you've really got to cram very quickly what you want to get out of your commentary, because there is just too much going on. It is quite difficult to keep on top of everything. And I was trying to understand last night the surfing. I still don't quite understand how you do well in that particular competition. But I will have to go and seek out a bit more.
Emily, have you forked out for Discovery Plus? Is that how you're watching it?
No, I'm afraid I'm a massive BBC loyalist. So if it's not, and I'm so used to the BBC commentators, I like them. They're also a lot of the Discovery Plus commentary stuff doesn't even have commentary, which I find maddening. Like even if it's commentary I don't like, I'd rather have it
than not.
It is. I'm kind of loyal to it, and if you've watched so many of these things with the same commentators, you kind of get, I'm looking forward to listening to whatever Steve Cram do, the athletics, etc. And the swim, it's kind of reassuringly, I don't know, something reassuring about it. For me, I appreciate other people have very different views. So it is brilliant. I
can see Ellen and Andrew talking about the Taekwondo. There's a lot of very high level Olympics excitement, not as high as your Olympics excitement, Emily, but talk to us today. I've given you my expert sports commentator observation on the high precedence of Leeds-based athletes and other sports people winning medals. I wonder what you think about that.
It's very true.
Borne out by the data.
There is.
I knew it.
You've got quite a few medals. You'd be very high in the medal table. I mean, I have to admit, as I said to you earlier, trying to get Leeds specifically, not just Yorkshire, is a little bit trickier. But Matty Lee, Tom Pidcock, and Bradley Sinden,
Leeds based.
Exactly. And it's a bit like, amazing Welsh athletes in other sports. Yorkshire seems to be amazing. And, one of the Brownlee brothers, 5th in the triathlon, really not bad at all. So you are doing what you have done in successive Olympics with Team GB, which is pull us up the medal table. So
You're welcome. You're welcome, the south of England. Leeds is here to save everybody's face after dismal performance in the football. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that. Emily, what's happening tonight?
So we have something I keep going on about, which is the epic battles between Katie Ledecky and Ariane Titmus in the freestyle. Titmus won the 400 meters. There's a 200 meter final overnight, and then Ledecky goes in the 1500 meter final at the end of that's the first time that event's happened for women in the Olympic Games. She's definitely, it's amazing. It's brilliant racing. They are up against each other.
Yeah.
The men's Rowing 4 final. It's a very traditionally good event for Team GB. 4 new guys in that boat, so see how it goes. The Rugby Sevens final. Will Fiji defend the title they won for the first time? Jack Law is trying to retain his 3-meter springboard synchro gold that he won last time with a new partner. This time, Daniel Goodfellow. We've got the men's team, the men's individual gymnastics all-around team final, and anyone that's interested in gymnastics, it was quite a day in the women's team final today. I mean, there's too much, but there are some of my highlights. And the baseball starts for all of you who like baseball, which I think may not be that many, but I do.
Emily, you might, I know your love of the Olympics is about the sport part, not unsurprisingly, but how's the feeling about the games in Tokyo? You got a sense of whether people have relaxed into it? Does it seem like it's going well? I mean, it's very weird. I feel, we'll come on and talk about Simone Biles in a second. I feel for the sports people. Jay Jones mentioned the weirdness of performing in these empty stadiums. It must feel really strange, like worse pressure, not because you don't get the sort of payoff of the adrenaline with the crowd sort of lifting you.
Yeah, I mean, it's for some people that might work better, but for anyone that's used to being able to look up at their supporters, to feed off that, I mean, it's I mean, don't forget, some of these sports, a lot of these athletes, you know, it's not like every meet they go to is Olympic Games. You know, there are sparsely attended events. Yeah. But, you know, you raise your game to the Olympics, it's totally different. It feels very different. So I can understand why it must be really, really difficult for them. I mean, one of the good things I would say, hopefully for the host nation, I feel terrible knowing how brilliant London 2012 was for London and the country, how I mean, it's just gutting but you know, Japan has done very, very well. They've had lots of success in different things. The first skateboarding gold medal to a 13-year-old. They won the softball last night. So there are reasons to be cheering on their team. And the few events that have been outside, like the triathlon, you know, people have, even though they have been asked not to, have come to cheer. So I think it's, you know, I mean, it's only day 4, but there are real great reasons to cheer if you're Japan. And you know, it's been really tough for a huge amount of these athletes, and you know, an extra year, the disruption to training. I mean, Tom Dean, who won gold in the 200-meter freestyle, you know, he caught COVID twice in the course of the last year. Yeah. Second time stuck in isolation in his hotel room. So you know, this is not and you know, I just don't understand how some people can, how people are supposed to withstand the level of pressure that some of these people have been put under. And I mean, it's great, and I'm as guilty of it as anyone, to get super excited and I can't wait to watch XYZ. But I mean, you know, I just have to watch these people to actually do it. It's crazy, and people are being more open about the pressure that puts on.
The pressure is spectacular, and we've all probably now watched Tom Daly, and oh my gosh, I've forgotten the name of his new diving partner. You'll remember, Emily. What's it called? The partner?
Matty Lee.
There you go. Thank you. And he said, hasn't he? It's like your whole life's work in the diving competition is over in less than 10 seconds because the amount of time they're actually diving is sort of a tiny amount of time, and they're standing there at the edge of the board and you just think, oh my God, I can't conceive of how it must feel. I mean, I guess they get trained, do they, to put it out of their mind, but still to run through it again and again and again and again and again and again, it must send you a bit nuts.
I mean, I don't know how. It's just they are superhuman. I mean, these are unbelievable extraordinary feats, but it's the I mean, there's the physicality of what you have to do, but then there's the mental pressure of what you have to do. I mean, that's a whole nother ball game, and just, you know, you know, your mind can be your, you know, for many people will know, it can be your own worst enemy in some times, and it is amazing that these people have to cope with the mental pressure and then perform like superhuman physical feats at the same time. It's
extraordinary.
But they're doing it all day, every day over the next day 4. So we've got 13 days.
Yeah. Amazing. Thanks, Emily. I do want to talk about Simone Biles and just to dig in a bit more about this pressure, because obviously Naomi Osaka opted out of the tennis, and then Simone Biles, who is one of the most extraordinary sports people / women I think that there is, somebody whose work and talent and extraordinary achievements I've sort of watched and enjoyed most of my adult life. She is a really staggering person. And actually I watched her, was she in the team, was it yesterday? I think it was Sunday. And you just watch her tumble, and right enough, she wasn't quite on her game, if you like, in that she sort of stumbled a little bit and fell and took steps in a way that she would normally name it. But you watch the woman fire into the air and just do the most extraordinary things, and you can't fail but feel real sort of joy and adrenaline watching her. But it sort of feels like, in fact, if Matt is there, Matt D'Ancona, it feels like, and I know you've written about this in your book, well, I don't know, is it the case that something has changed now in relation to the pressure that these people, and by definition young people, find themselves under, that it is just almost, it has become almost unbearable? Is that the difference?
Well, the trouble is, of course, we're dealing with very limited data sets here. And, you know, what happened to Simone Biles today is probably different to what happened to Naomi Osaka and Emma Raducanu at Wimbledon.
Yeah.
But it does strike me, because I was thinking back to the first Olympics I was conscious of, which was the 76 Montreal Olympics, which was amazing gymnastics, because it was the first time in the Olympics that people had got perfect tens. So Nadia Comaneci, Nelly Kim got perfect tens, and it was a massive moment. So the pressure is not new, but I think something has changed, and it's not confined to sport, which is that the pressure cooker, which has always been on in elite sports and in much lower level, in positions of great pressure, is now beginning to boil up. And you very kindly mentioned that I'd been writing about this last year, which I was, and that was very much in the context of the correlation between the growth of standardized testing and exam mania and the reduction of schools to exam factories, and the correlation of that with addiction amongst teenagers to performance-related prescription drugs, mainly Adderall, which enables them to study later and in a very compressed period of time, but takes a terrible toll. And you look across if you look at the whole thing as a landscape, there is no question that the pressures upon people in competitive environments of all sorts seem to me to be becoming, grotesque in some directions. Now, part of that is because more people feel able to report their problems, which is a good thing. Part of that is that more people are coming forward and saying, I can't do this, and employers or coaches or whatever are responding. And what's interesting in the response to Simone Biles is that, apart from a few mad trolls on Twitter and everything, everyone is incredibly sympathetic. So that is a huge step forward. There's arguably the greatest gymnast of all time. I mean, she does have a claim to that title already. Pulling out of the Olympics, possibly the whole of the Olympics we wait to see, is treated as a matter for great personal sympathy, rather than somehow letting America down or getting herself down. That's a good thing. The bad side, I think, is that there is some sort of structural problem here, and I hesitate to sort of reach for the easy social media explanation. It's all Twitter and Instagram. I rather think that's a symptom of the problem rather than the cause. But there is no doubt that we are, competition, like every other form of human behavior, needs to be regulated and monitored. And it seems to me that even though all these elite athletes have, therapists and life coaches as well as physical coaches, that a greater number of them, particularly at the younger end, are faltering in a way that's alarming. And it's got something to do with both the athletic expectations upon them, but also, I think, the nature of the scrutiny, which is simply, not just constant, but omnidirectional. And I don't have a kind of glib answer to what's happening, but there is certainly a tectonic shift happening in all of this that affects everyone from, kids doing their A levels to the world's greatest gymnast pulling out of the team event in Tokyo. There is a continuum there, and it merits more analysis, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Matt. I'm going to go to Tom McCallum, who you know of people who are coaching athletes in Tokyo now. Hiya, Tom.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you? Nice to see you.
Cheers.
You know some people who are out there.
Yeah.
And tell us what you think about this. You've talked about the rounded athlete and the sort of importance of mental health as part of your overall training regime.
Well, if I just center it on swimming, for example, fantastic for Tom Dean to win today. And the favorite was another Team GB swimmer, Duncan Scott, who was the #1 ranked swimmer in the world and the world champion. And he didn't finish properly. His actual finish touch technically was incorrect, and he lost by 400ths. He now has a whole bunch more events to do. Now, I don't know Duncan, I don't know his specific coach, but I know some of the Team GB coaches. And I also am very immersed in that sport globally. They will absolutely be focused upon his mindset and his well-being in the coming days, because he has a lot to do for that team. And at the point I made in the chat was, while we may, of being a little bit glib, turn our attention to certain sports, the Olympics once every 4 years, swimming being one of them, the most successful programs that typically, thrive over the long term are already on the case with this. US gymnastics, one of the reasons Simone Biles is still competing, as Matt and others may know, is to shine the light on the way those young athletes have been abused in different ways, including around their mental health. And she was one of those victims. And one of the reasons she's still competing is to shine a light on that, which is a whole new level of burden, as well as being a woman of color in a sport that's underrepresented. But I guess my point is that it's tough to quickly turn a societal lens on it for 2 to 3 weeks and then turn it off. But the highly successful programs will have been focusing on the rounded athlete the whole way along. And a big British success is actually continues to be Loughborough Swimming, which had 2 swimmers in one of the women's finals yesterday, neither of whom swam for Team GB. They swam for Sweden and France. Right, so we're now beginning to, they're recognizing the strength of that program in developing the whole athlete to a truly elite level. Now, yes, Adam Peaty swims there, right? But so do many others. So I guess the point being is that those who are already on the case will see this. Others have a hell of a lot of catching up to do, including women's pro tennis, including gymnastics.
Yeah, interesting. I wonder if there's a way that we could sort of rank quite, but drill into which sports are getting it right, which sports are getting it wrong. Even look at the way that the new Olympic sports, the kind of skateboarding and surfing, those kinds of sports, maybe they're setting things up, start doing it right rather than have to go do it wrong and then correct. I don't know if there's a way that we could look into it. Andrew Butler, you're making a point in the chat about the role of the media coverage. And maybe this talks to Emily's point about if you've got less time, you have to focus in. So maybe the star performers get even more heat as a consequence of that.
Yeah, I was just quite interested in essentially that I don't want to kind of say that everyone is complicit, but watching any of the gymnastics in the last couple of days, you would have seen on the BBC, you would have seen that it was all hooked on Simone Biles. It was kind of what can she do, what is she going to do. She's got kind of she's got new moves that she wants to try out, etc., etc. This all sets out like a perpetual cycle of pressure. Now she would have had sponsors as well trying to guarantee that she would perform to X sort of level, so that she would get further deals. It's no surprise that that she's probably felt the pressure too much. She's said that she's going to come back for her individual events. She was on the sidelines as well as soon as she kind of came off. So she was obviously under such immense pressure herself that she felt that she couldn't quite compete. But you know, I hope that she's well. But it is one of those things that this cycle comes from everywhere, and it was probably only when she was you know, there on the bars or on the beam or on the mat that she, you know, it all kind of came right on top of her.
Yeah, bless her. Like you say, I hope she is well, of course. Tessa, are you there? You there, Tessa? Hiya. I've never heard, and I don't know, again, maybe I've just got sort of selective deafness on this, but I've never heard that phrase mental injury before. But it's an interesting one where you're sort of saying, have we reached a point in some sports, perhaps the more enlightened ones, where if someone effectively suffers a sort of incident that's equivalent to hurting themselves, you know, falling over, hurting your ankle, and or not performing in the way that you wanted to on a piece of apparatus is an equivalent sort of injury that would be treated in the same way as, you know, you see them dashing on with their bag of tricks and pain relief and things. Do you think that's the case?
I don't know. I just made it up, so I don't know if it does exist. But it just struck me to sort of Matt's point about the sympathy with which these moments are being met. And actually, I don't know if you agree, Matt, but I think the sympathy has increased since Wimbledon, where they got it so badly wrong in their initial response. I'm trademarking it, Tom. But it does, I do think something's shifted and fairly recently. Now, nobody wants to see people suffer in the way that Naomi had to make that change, but I think it has changed. I wonder, it's the trickle down, isn't it? I think, again, just completely agreeing with Matt, as I always do, the aims of perfection, whether that's body image, whether it's success, whether it's out achieving, you know, normal standards, we see it in sport, we see it in all sorts of other industries, creates a sense that we all have to be extraordinary. And that has trickled down to what is deemed to be a reasonable life, doing a reasonable job, getting reasonable grades, being a kind of reasonable contributor to society is just sort of not cutting it. You've got to be extraordinary. Yeah. And that pressure is brutal on kids. And so my point was, again, back to this sort of anxiety, I think there's a great openness about talking about neurodiversity now, which is good. I think there's a positive conversation being had around mental health. That's great. I think that there are unhealthy responses where kids feel anxiety and pressure that isn't a mental health issue, it's just endemic, and are turning to prescribed amphetamines as a solution to that. You know, I can go hands and toes on the number of my kids' friends who just want a prescription because they think that will sort them out.
So prescribed, what would I go to the doctor and be prescribed amphetamines for in relation to mental health? What does that treat?
Well, attention, ADHD.
Oh, is it? ADHD?
ADHD, thanks.
Yeah.
Or dyslexia in my case.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is, thanks, Matt. That is the sort of default required diagnosis that anxious teenagers think might sort them out. Sorry, that is a massively glib generalization, but what I'm saying is that it's being medical, you know, they think there's a medical solution to what is actually an environmental issue. I think of course there are people who have ADHD, but I think the kids are looking for a quick solution to the anxiety that they feel.
Yeah, interesting. Phoebe just saying a big movement on TikTok to talk about symptoms of ADHD. I didn't know that it was treated with amphetamines, I have to say.
And shed loads of Xanax, that's right.
Shed loads of Xanax, gosh. Maybe this is something that we ought to look into as well. I mean, the drive, you know, the sort of desire for a pill that makes everything better is not new. Maybe the availability of said pills is new, and the environmental factors that cause people to experience things that, you know, requires them to seek help. it feels like there's something to pick at in there. I just want to come to Andrew Girdwood, because as ever, you've been super active in the chat, Andrew, and you've commented on a number of things we've talked about. I hadn't spotted this, publicists giving people time off if you're undergoing, is it fertility treatment you just said? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right, fertility treatment.
Hiya, nice to see you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I not necessarily the world's biggest publicist fan, but I can't really fault them for their new policies. So it's like surrogacy, 26 weeks full pay leave. That's the same as, you know, pregnancy. And also, love this one, a phased return to work. Now, you'd assume many employers would allow that, but it's not really an obligation. So to put it in writing is great. And I think a phased return to work is so important, because if you're off for an extended period of time, either with kids or illness or mental illness, a phased return to work just makes it much more approachable to you. I think, and you're more likely to succeed and be less disruptive to your colleagues. I bet we've all experienced what happens when somebody pops back in the office after a long period out. It can be quite disruptive, and I think it's worth it for the employers, right? Because it's all about keeping the talent in the agency. Because the thing about, you know, PR, ads, journalism, I imagine your talent is the people, and they just leave so easily. So I think it's a win-win. I hope to see more of it.
Yeah, interesting. Same, and yeah, well done, publicists. I don't know if that's going to be matched now by all the other big holding companies, advertising holding companies, whether they're last to announce it. I don't know. I wonder. I've kept an interest in the story about JWT. I don't know if that's registered on people's radar. Just in summary, sorry, my colleagues over there are saying, don't touch your neck. Sorry about the microphone. The very famous advertising agency called JWT, J. Walter Thompson, I think it's now called something different, I can't remember, but they have made two senior men redundant some time ago. And the men have been successful in having they took them to tribunal. They won the tribunal for discrimination, I believe, on the grounds of the basis of their sex. And these two particular men, and the coverage of the tribunal in the Mail Online has really focused on a woman who did not lose her job, or I think maybe she was promoted round about the same sort of time, who is gay, has really particularly been sort of targeted and made a character in the story of this the redundancy and then the tribunal. It's a sort of the shorthand of it from a sort of tabloid take is, political correctness gone mad. Look at these capable men who've been kicked out of their jobs, and now they're giving all the jobs away to people who don't deserve them. It's very a very interesting story now that the sort of advertising agency and the media owners who typically have a very particular relationship, Wunderman Thompson is a new name of JWT, has a big media arm, and I think it's worth. It is certainly something that happens in Adland that is now has resonance beyond that. Anyway, so definitely worth having a look at that story, because it's not going to go away now that it's the Mail Online has opted in and the ad industry are fighting back. It's not going to go away. We're on 28 minutes past 7, and it's just the die-hard four of us here in the newsroom shivering in the cold of the air conditioning. I want to say a big thank you to everybody who's joined us. This is our last week of ThinkIns before we break for the summer. Tomorrow evening, the very wonderful John Amici will be talking to Matt about his new book, Promises of Giants. As everybody knows, he is a giant. He's also a giant intellectually, and in terms of heart and soul, he's a brilliant person and will be lovely to listen to. Real feel good, I hope, and thought provoking. person to listen to. And then on Thursday, hopefully with more than 4 of us, it's our summer drinking, where unfortunately it can only be us tortoises here in the newsroom. I'll be making cocktails, we'll be sharing some stories, talking about what's coming up. Please do join us for that. It's always a bit of fun. Look out for the app where we'll be putting the ingredients so that you can make yourself a tipsy tortoise cocktail. What more could you want? And join us for that. And then we break for the summer and we're back on the 1st of September. Have a great evening and I will see you tomorrow. All the best. Bye.